My name is Mehrnoush Yazdanyar, and I'm an attorney who specializes in Iran sanctions regulations. In the past few weeks, my office has received numerous phone calls from individuals all over the country with questions regarding what happened on implementation day and how the removal of the nuclear sanctions impact U.S. persons. So I've put together a list of questions that most of our clients have been asking in an effort to address those questions, answer those questions, and address those issues in the short time that we have available. Obviously, this is not a comprehensive overview of the changes or the regulations, so for more information, please feel free to contact our office or consult with another legal representative. The first and most important question we keep receiving is, did implementation day result in the removal of all Iran sanctions? And the answer to that question is no. The most important thing for a US person to remember is that the United States government has put various types of sanctions and has administered various types of sanctions programs against Iran. The sanctions that were removed on implementation day were strictly regarding the nuclear sanctions, the secondary sanctions that were in place. In addition to those sanctions, the United States government has put into place primary sanctions, which is the comprehensive trade ban or the trade embargo that we have heard of. For the most part, those regulations remain intact. What was changed and removed was the secondary sanctions related to non-US persons. These were the nuclear-related sanctions that the United States had put into place that put restrictions on what non-US persons, non-US entities could do vis-a-vis Iran. As a result of the removal of those sanctions, non-US persons, so not US persons, the non-US persons, individuals and entities that are foreign and not of the United States are permitted to engage in certain types of activities with Iran that they were not allowed to do so previously. A general, very broad overview of what some of those activities are. We have banking and financial sanctions were lifted, so the non-US entities and individuals are permitted to engage in banking and financial activities with Iran. They're permitted to have bank accounts for Iranian nationals abroad, deal with the Iranian rial, deal with the Central Bank of Iran, and a list of other activities that were previously prohibited. Similarly, non-US persons are now permitted to engage in insurance-related activities to insure and underwrite individuals, businesses, and entities and goods in Iran. As well as they are permitted to now participate in Iran's energy and petrochemical sectors. They are also permitted to engage or permitted to be a part of Iran's shipbuilding sectors, as well as in the dealings of golds and other precious metals, as well as soft metalware such as aluminum, coal, and other types. And for a more complete list, like I mentioned, please feel free to contact my office. But most important thing that I want to highlight is that all of these things that we've discussed thus far are related to the lifting of the nuclear sanctions and pertain to non-US persons and not to US persons. Therefore, contrary to what most people seem to believe, just maybe because of the way that the implementation day has been depicted in the media, and we often see it being said that Iran's sanctions have been lifted, it's important to understand, yes, certain sanctions were lifted, but many Iran sanctions remain in place. So before a US person does anything vis-a-vis Iran, it's important and imperative to understand if that conduct is permitted under the current regulations. So that brings me to the second type of question that was asked, and that is, well, how did this impact US persons? The United States government did enact certain regulations that do impact US persons as a result of implementation day. One thing that they did is they issued a general license that permits foreign entities and foreign companies that are owned by a US person to engage in the same types of activities that the non-US persons are now allowed to engage in as a result of the lifting of the nuclear sanctions. So if you are a US individual and you own a foreign entity, so you have more than 50% ownership or that you control that entity abroad, that entity with certain restrictions is permitted to engage in the same types of activities that the non-US persons are now permitted to engage in as a result of the lifting of the nuclear sanctions. There are certain restrictions in terms of the level of involvement the US person can have with that company, so it's again very important to take a close look at the regulations. Additionally, the government has issued a general license that now permits the importation of Iranian origin foodstuffs as well as carpets. That's where we hear that now the importation of caviar, pistachios, saffron is permitted. You can now import these items as well as carpets and other textiles into the United States. There are restrictions in terms of how you can pay individuals for the importation of those goods and what individuals you are permitted to work with. It's very important to realize that the United States government still has in place a specially designated nationals list. This is a list of individuals and entities that no matter what, even if an activity is generally licensed or licensed, you are not permitted to work with these entities. So it's extremely important to understand, if you are going to conduct an activity that is permitted under the regulations, that you are not dealing with anyone who is on the specially designated nationals list. And finally, the government issued what they have been calling a favorable licensing policy for license requests dealing with the exportation of parts and or services related to civilian aircraft and airplane industries, meaning that if you can, it's not generally licensed, so it's not just, you're not permitted to export goods and services regarding civilian aircraft, either building it or developing it or whatever. You're not allowed to just do it. You have to apply for a license. But if the government will have a favorable licensing policy, and will do it if you can show that this is going to be for civilian aircraft and that you're not dealing or working with any designated nationals. And finally, the question that we get is, so what now? What are we doing? What is the current state of the law? What is the current regulations? And it's important to realize the regulations are always changing. Right now, in February of 2016, there is still a comprehensive trade ban against Iran. This basic trade ban is implemented through the law, which is the Iranian Transactions and Sanctions Regulations. It's primarily put into place through these regulations. Under these regulations, a U.S. person is still prohibited from the importation or exportation of goods or services from Iran or to Iran. And a U.S. person is still prohibited from investing in Iran or doing business with Iran unless a license has been issued for that activity. And another point of confusion is what a license is. We have two types of licenses, which is basically an authorization issued by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, who is the body responsible for implementing sanctions law and enforcing these sanctions. According to OFAC's regulations, there can be a general license, or your activity can be generally licensed, meaning the government has come and said that certain types of activities and transactions are generally licensed for all individuals. If the activity in which you want to engage in is generally licensed and permitted, you don't need to seek separate authorization from OFAC. However, you may need to take certain steps either with your bank or with other entities involved in the transaction to ensure transparency, whether when it comes to the receipt of payment or the receipt of funds or sending anything to Iran or receiving anything from Iran. If an activity you wish to engage in has not been generally licensed, meaning the government has not said that this type of activity is permitted, then you must specifically seek authorization from OFAC, from the government, for that activity for your case. So you first have to look at the transaction that you want to engage in. You have to see that if the government has issued a general license saying that this is okay under the current regulations, and if not, then you need to go through the process of applying for a specific license from OFAC. And lastly, who is a U.S. person? A U.S. person is a individual or as a citizen, a legal permanent resident of the United States, someone who has a visa and is in the United States on a visa, or an entity that was formed under the laws and regulations of the United States. So if you fall into any of those categories, if you want to engage in any transactions or have any dealings with Iran, it's very important that you ensure that that particular activity is permitted, because the regulations have not changed to the point where all sanctions have been removed. A small subset of sanctions have been removed and certain changes have been made to the law, but the sanctions remain largely intact. For additional information, please feel free to contact my firm at www.yazdanyarlawoffices.com. You may also contact us directly via telephone 310-780-6360. Thank you.